everywhere on social media at Keaton D. Nichols. That is at Keaton D. Nichols. Shout out to my homie Philip Roundtree. We were able to link up on Monday for a joint podcast. His podcast, Rhetorically Speaking, my podcast, A Nichols Worth. We were able to have a great conversation on Monday. So shout out definitely to Philip Roundtree. Go check out his podcast. He's on to some really good stuff. Happy Wednesday to everyone that is out there. I appreciate you joining me here, whether or not it's on Facebook. We're streaming live on Twitter right now, streaming live on Instagram as well. Make sure you all follow me on all those platforms and follow the show page on Facebook. Just search A Nichols Worth, and on Anchor, make sure you subscribe. Anchor.fm/A Nichols Worth. On this Wednesday, just a happy reminder, as a lot of other news stories seemingly are taking over in the news cycle, that Black folk are not going to be the main story much longer. As a matter of fact, I would already argue that in many senses that the movement for Black lives, if you will, and the attention that has been paid to it in the last couple of months is already faded from national attention, from nationwide attention, and is now on the sort of downward trend that we oftentimes see news stories like this sort of take. It's a reminder because a lot of the progress that we have felt that we have made in the last couple of weeks will begin to fade from reality in these next couple of weeks. A lot of the anticipation, a lot of the good feeling that we had about the seeming change that was being made in society will fade away in the next couple of weeks. A lot of it will. And there's still a lot of it that will be genuine, that will stay, and that I think that individuals and companies and larger organizations like that will absolutely stick to. But as this becomes less of a trending topic, it's important to sort of note what the reaction from everyone will truly be in this situation. Kind of like we referenced with Black History Month, that Black History Month is not just it's not the only month that we should recognize and celebrate, Black heroes, Black innovators, and things like that. By the time March comes around, the middle of March and April comes around, it's almost like folks have sort of stepped out of that mold, or that same energy isn't there anymore. And so we're seeing a version of that now as, again, the coverage of protests and stand-ins and interrupting traffic, things like that, things that are still going on now have become much less the story in the media cycle. That's a conversation that I think that we should have about our media cycle and the way that information is sort of presented. What is the value of having a particularly hot story, and what is the media's responsibility in sort of bringing some sort of morality to some of these news stories as well, because that there's some there. I think whenever we start talking about that kind of stuff. But as I mentioned, the movement for Black lives absolutely has not stopped. It's just that the continual news coverage has. And in this moment, don't be fooled into thinking that just because it's not a trending topic, that it's not important anymore. There's a lot of people, both Black and white, who have come to particular realizations in the last couple of weeks about what kind of country that they have been living in. And those kind of revelations have been at times uncomfortable. They've been at times kind of awkward, all types of really weird sort of feelings that have come up, I think, with a lot of people in the last couple of weeks, because we've realized, I think, in a sense, that we've been living in a system for so long, and at times propping up that system unknowingly in many cases, just as a way of normalizing some of the behavior and some of the acts that we had seen or that we continually see on TV and some other places as well. Well, the last couple of weeks, those events hit differently, and the reaction to those events were absolutely different. But as the coverage slows down, we've got to remember that that having media literacy in this moment is sort of key, right? Having media literacy, a part of having media literacy, I think, is being able to look at what we're being presented, the information that we're being presented, and being able to pick what is true to us, what is useful to us, and being able to filter out those things that may be distractions or that might not be important on the mission, if you will, the movement for a better country, especially for Black and brown people. That media literacy involves a lot of things in general. But I think keeping the focus, just because the mainstream media might not be focusing on this anymore, your local news might not be reporting on this as much anymore, doesn't mean that it's not a big topic, doesn't mean that the fight or that your fight has to be over at this point. It has to be every single day. And we have to be able to flip the tables, to use a biblical example, essentially to bring about the kind of change that we want. I just had a conversation with a friend of mine the other night about using that analogy about flipping tables. I think right now, a lot of people are saying, look, we're on our way to change. We're changing things now actively. I think we're in like the brainstorming phase right now. We're in the brainstorming phase. I think actual and true revolution will feel like revolution, not just sort of look and sound like revolution, but it will feel like revolution. We will be made to be uncomfortable at the actual start of the revolution, not feel uncomfortable. We will be uncomfortable. That's how we know that things are going to be moving down the line in an approach that will be able to sort of make and affect actual change. That's what I'm looking for in this instance. So I'm not going to rely upon media sources to tell me that the revolution has happened. Of course, a Gil Scott-Heron quote that's very famous. The revolution will not be televised doesn't just mean that I don't know what people, I guess, assume it to mean, but what I take it to mean in that within that context is that, what we might see in our media streams and within our scope of content as it is now might not reflect the urgency of the need to continue to fight for Black lives in this country. So let's not forget that. Let's not forget that as it fades from the mainstream's eye. Appreciate everyone joining me on the conversation as well. Just a reminder to those folks that might be new or coming back and maybe you just forgot, please feel free to leave your comments and questions in the comment section there on Facebook or on Instagram, wherever you are listening right now. And I'll try and get to them either during the show or whenever I'm done, of course, with my rant for the day. And boy, my goodness, the situation this week happening with NASCAR surrounding, of course, one of their drivers, the only Black full-time driver, Bubba Wallace, has made my head spin. I don't know who else is kind of with me on this, but I've just been like almost like flabbergasted. I don't know if the proper word is, but I feel like I've been flabbergasted at the news coming from this whole situation with Bubba Wallace. And for those that hadn't heard, Bubba Wallace, again, the only African-American driver on the NASCAR circuit. There's a number of, sort of levels, I guess, to it. The NASCAR circuit is or the series that he's in, I should say, is kind of like the highest of all the levels. Kind of like if there's like a professional, an amateur, semi-pro, amateur, that kind of thing. Well, you could say that Bubba Wallace is the only Black driver on that pro circuit, the full-time driver on that pro circuit. And there was a noose found in his team garage over the weekend, this coming right after NASCAR had, of course, announced at Bubba Wallace's request, by the way, that Confederate flags not be displayed at all at NASCAR events. In other words, NASCAR completely banning the use and the display of the Confederate flag at NASCAR races. Well, the very next race on the schedule after that announcement was at Talladega Superspeedway in, you guessed it, Alabama. Part of that Southern belt of very interesting politics, but either way, there was a noose that was found over the weekend in his garage. Obviously, that prompted a huge response. NASCAR requested that the FBI investigate the incident and see who could be maybe held responsible for such a ridiculous act. Now, the notion coming into this FBI investigation and the feeling coming into this FBI investigation was actually one that seemingly was trending. There goes that word again, trending in the right direction. NASCAR, a less than progressive organization since its creation in the 40s, and that's really the nicest way that I could put it, had been under fire for a long time, of course, for a less than welcoming environment for African Americans in this country, including its sort of lack of pushback against the use of the Confederate flag at races. that was this was the sort of momentum going into the FBI investigation. Once it was reported that this was something that happened to Bubba Wallace, the reaction was very different than what happened after the FBI investigation, though I don't exactly know why. The reaction beforehand said, this is a terrible, absolutely heinous event, and that this is not reflective of NASCAR or the people that work for NASCAR or at NASCAR. NASCAR vowed that once they find the person that was responsible for the noose being placed, if you will, placed in the garage of Bubba Wallace, would be slapped with a lifetime ban from NASCAR. It seemed to make sense, right? And if the FBI found who was responsible for this, it's very easy to levy hate crime charges against this person. However, 48 hours after the FBI investigation, this report coming from ABC News, the FBI said Tuesday a noose found in the team garage of NASCAR driver Bubba Wallace at the Talladega Superspeedway has been there since last year, and therefore he is not the victim of a hate crime. The article goes on to mention that NASCAR, mentioning the FBI report, described the item as, get this, right? A garage door pull rope that was fashioned like a noose. Big misunderstanding, right? Instead of there being a noose, according to the FBI, I mean, it's just processing all this became a little bit much for me yesterday, but I think I got it right? Like the FBI went in and they investigated and they found that the noose wasn't exactly a noose. It was a rope that was tied or fashioned in the style of a noose. This is just the beginning of this lunacy that came out of this report. Now, I'm no Boy Scout or anything. I don't have my knot certification badge. But I'm pretty sure that there's a few things that are true of nooses, that they don't get accidentally tied like that. There is no accidental noose. Whoops. Rope got all bunched up. Nobody was really paying attention to it. Nobody readjusted it or unwound it, and it ended up in a noose. Sorry. That doesn't happen. Again, I'm no rope expert. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure about this one. The other thing to mention, of course, about this is that any item, any string-like item or cord or rope-like item that is fashioned, as according to the FBI here, fashioned like a noose, is a noose. If someone is hanging by an electrical rope that is fashioned like a noose, I don't think anyone would be willing to say that that knot just so happened to kill this person that hanged themselves from it. No, it's a noose. Just because it's not a noose before it started, because a noose wasn't tied and then placed in the garage, doesn't make it not a noose. I mean, this should be obvious, right? The other part of the FBI investigation said that the noose, or the pull-down rope, that was fashioned like a noose, had been that way since at least last October of 2019, in garage stall number 4, if you will. There was no way that before being assigned this garage stall last week that anyone could have known that Bubba Wallace would have been in that stall. That's what the FBI says. This is not a hate crime. It wasn't a noose. It was a rope fashioned like a noose. And this noose had been in there. By the way, it's not a noose, but it is a noose, right? This noose had been in there since last October. And so there's no way that it was intentional. Yeah, a noose might have been found, even though we're not calling it a noose. But it wasn't intentional, you see? It said a few things, I think, about a few things, if you will. This FBI investigation lasting 48 hours obviously stopped well short of a complete investigation because it left so many more questions. As a matter of fact, I'd argue that it sort of dusted up more questions than it answered. I mean, even if we are to take the FBI report at its word or at where we are within this, I still have a lot of questions. Who tied the garage stall to look like a noose? Because in the other 42 garage stalls, if you will, on the NASCAR circuit, none of them seem to be tied like a noose. Not now, not back in October, at any point. But this one was. And so who did that? Didn't accidentally end up that way. We know that because of my theory on ropes from earlier, right? The other question I have is if this was seen in October of 2019 anywhere, if what we saw on Monday, that reflection of all those drivers coming out and supporting Bubba Wallace and the pit crews and all these other people that say that they are against that idea. Remember, before the investigation, against the idea of this noose being found and wanting to support the circuit's only black driver. If that progressive of an environment existed the entire time, then back in 2019 October, somebody, if this noose was around since back then, should have undone it or should have reported it in some sort of way that something should have been done with it by then. That's simple. That's very simple here. Okay, and so what we end up with at the end of the day is nothing actually ends up happening as a result of this. Bubba Wallace kind of has to backtrack in a sense from what information that he was given from a crew member of his and that NASCAR confirmed and continued on with an FBI investigation. Now, Bubba Wallace is now forced to say, well, maybe we jumped the gun here. I'm sorry. Now, I mean, as if we needed more excuses for people to sort of think that Bubba Wallace was making this whole thing up, potentially, or that he was making a big deal out of nothing. This now, in many ways, the results of the FBI investigation, which really wasn't an investigation at all, now validate a lot of those people's thinking. Again, it's not what's right, but it is what's happening. Very much so. Still, there are a lot of people that say that the bigger story is that NASCAR responded in the way that it did. We ought to be happy NASCAR responded in the way that it did, because that is showing, in effect, progress. Progress. Maybe it wasn't really a noose, but at least NASCAR responded in the proper way. At least they brought the proper energy to the table in responding to this. Well, we don't know that. Because we have a Department of Justice, which shouldn't have been trusted from the beginning, considering its track record at least under this administration, right? You have the Department of Justice investigating this within 48 hours, and because there were no hate crime charges that were filed, right? The Department of Justice decided not to prosecute or not to charge anyone or not to even put forth a fair and full investigation. And so therefore, because the FBI said that nothing racist happened, then nothing racist happened. It's like this sort of results-driven based sort of criteria that we have about a lot of issues on race here in this country. We say things to ourselves like, if we can get justice in this case, if we can prosecute these officers in this case, this is going to be considered a big victory, or it's going to be considered a very positive thing for justice. If we can just get this one case, that'll be a step in the right direction. The problem with that theory is that when we start being results driven about individual circumstances within a problematic system, then the same thing is going to happen whenever it doesn't exactly work out the way that we want either. I think it's great in the situation. I think it's terrible that's the situation with Walter Scott, who was shot in the back running away from Officer Michael Slager. I think it was awful that happened, but I think it was great that Michael Slager was so quickly held accountable for what happened in Charleston, South Carolina, North Charleston, South Carolina. In 2017, he was indicted. He was charged, sentenced rather, to 20 years nearly in prison for what he had done. That was considered a W. That was back in 2017. Obviously, it didn't stop the culture of over-policing African Americans in this country, let alone the state of South Carolina. If we get too results oriented, if we start to focus too much on the country being a result of what happens in these individual cases, then we're going to get too high on the highs and understandably too low on the lows. Like just remembering that feeling after Eric Gardner didn't get justice, right? Daniel Pantaleo walks away a free man, was a very sinking sort of feeling, much like the way that the 4 officers that were arrested in the case of George Floyd became like this thing that we could rally behind, and we could say, look, we are making progress because of this. In Atlanta, the killers of Rashard Brooks, those two officers, were immediately held accountable for what they had done, and and people stepped down, and there was all this reaction. We said, look, this is a positive step in the right direction, while at the same time we have the murder of Breonna Taylor continuing, the murderers of Breonna Taylor continuing to walk free today. I mean, only one of the officers has even been fired at this point. It's been months. It's been months. Is that actual progress? What situation do I look at if I'm looking at this from a results driven perspective? Which of those should I look at as being more reflective of what the country is right now? Because both of them are true. There are situations in which we are holding officers accountable when we make a big stink, when the country floods into the streets and protests and puts some pressure on some people, some public pressure. But what is that doing for Breonna Taylor? What is that doing for the countless other names? I read about another story today. I'm sorry, I guess this was yesterday, but I was reading about a story of this young man, I believe his last name is McLean, who was wrestled to the ground, who was injected with some sort of substance that caused his heart to stop, killed the poor boy. He was unarmed. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't, hurting or harming anyone. They've got the audio and I guess some video, some sort of video of what happened as well. And I thought to myself, well, I mean, this young man is deserving of justice. Like he deserves justice. What exactly makes us as a nation sort of hone in on certain cases and say we need justice in that case, but not other cases? I've talked about this before, but I think it goes back to our capacity to be able to sort of focus on what the task is at hand. Do we have enough capacity as a society to say, look, the change that we need here is not going to occur individually within any one of these cases. We can't have justice over here and over there and back there and over there. We can't say that that's justice until it's justice everywhere, until it's every single situation, every single case, if you will. Because otherwise, what's going to happen is, as soon as we continue to make progress, somebody's going to say, somebody else, some hater is going to come along and say, yeah, but you remember the situation with NASCAR and Bubba Wallace, right? And there wasn't even a news found. It wasn't even real. It was a hoax, whatever story that they want to put behind it, right? It might sound stupid, and that might not be a well-founded argument, but it is still something that I think a lot of people will find comfort in hiding behind, in effect. Got to get better at this kind of stuff. I think we'll know when that true revolution is there, because the tables will be flipped. People will not be so calm about what's going on. And I still think we haven't reached that point. Not nearly at all have we reached that point. We found out today, just a few hours before the show, that a Georgia grand jury has indicted the murderers of Ahmaud Arbery. A Cobb District Attorney Joyette M. Holmes announced on Wednesday that a grand jury voted to indict Gregory and Travis McMichael along with William Bryan for their felony murder and aggravated assault that resulted in Ahmaud Arbery's death. But here's the real kicker. The indictment comes 4 months to the day that Arbery was shot while on his daily jog. It's an open and shut case. It was very obvious, I think, what happens here. The result that we're seeing now the action that we're seeing now is as a result of people crying out, people making this a nationwide situation. You had people in Seattle, people in Texas, Maine, everywhere. They were saying, Ahmaud Arbery, yo, what's up with this? And we haven't arrested the people that are responsible? I mean, by the time that most people heard it, by the time I heard it, it had already been 2 months since the incident happened. And it took another 2 months of nationwide pressure to even get to this point. We cannot be results driven. We cannot say that we are ready for change as a nation once people get angry and or motivated enough to get up and do something. I mean, the backdrop of coronavirus right now. It's unprecedented. It's unheard of. It's unreal in some cases, in some instances. It's provided for us, I think, the necessary sort of pause that we've needed to breathe this moment in and to really take it in. And I think in that moment, we've seen a lot of proposed change in individuals and in organizations alike. I think we've seen that. But it can't take this every time. If we say to ourselves, we got justice because we marched in the streets for 4 months or for 2 months or for 60 days, whatever the case is, we marched, and that's what caused people to react. It's good now, but it's not going to sustain in the future. Our bodies will get tired. We will get tired. Our souls will get tired from having to argue every single inch of the concept that Black lives matter, that justice ought to be served in situations like this. It's exhausting. It gets inside of us. And I think that it's unfair to continually hold ourselves to this extremely high standard. We as Black folk and those that support us have to go 10 times as hard to get people in power to understand very basic concepts. It's my advocacy, and it's a big reason why I support flipping of tables, so to speak. It's a reference that I'm using in the Bible that, goes back to, in short, to make a long story short, when Jesus comes back to the temple and he sees that there's all these people selling wares and disrespecting the sanctity of the temple. And Jesus, a lot of people know him as, they would like to think that he's this, sort of non-violent guy, if you will. He goes in and quite literally flips the tables in the temple of the people that are selling wares and such. He tells them, everybody to get out. He destroys the temple in effect. And people are like, wow, man, people forget about that story about Jesus. But I look at that and I say to myself that Jesus saw that it wasn't just the individuals that had possessed the market that were the problem. It was the idea that the market was something else. And it wasn't a simple matter of replacing those individuals that had, sort of disrespected the sanctity of the temple. It was about destroying the temple as it was. That was the only way to affect real change. And we've got to start flipping tables. It's not about just replacing the people at the tables. It's about flipping the tables. We've got to understand that anything rather short of that is not a true revolution. Anything short of that is selling ourselves short of what kind of society we could be building for ourselves. That's what's going to be hard in this moment, because there's going to be a lot of people falling off in the next couple of weeks. Whenever the rubber meets the road, when it comes time to actually flip that table, you're going to look to your right and look to your left, and you're not going to have the same allies by you that appear to be by you right now. Being Black is not a trend for people of color, for Black people, Black and brown people. This is not a trend. We're like this every day. Whether or not people are talking about it or not, I have a much, much higher chance of being shot and killed by the police than your average white person in this country. It's not just a higher average, it's deadly for people of color. The perceptions that we see in the environment and the culture that we see reinforced in situations like the Confederate flag in NASCAR, or this rope situation that was fashioned like a noose, according to the FBI. These are the things that become real for us every day. There might be other individuals that can dip in and out of these conversations. They can say to themselves, hey, man, I want to push and I want to cape for Black lives right now. That's cool, but I have to do that every single day. And in order to affect that change, I need everybody on it every day, whether or not you're Black or not. And right now, we don't have that. It's not going to happen magically, I think, only by force, if you will. I strongly believe that. We're not going to change this country by convincing enough people that it's not cool to be racist. It's not hip. It's not the thing to be racist. It's not cool to hate. It's not cool to prop up symbols and systems of hate. I mean, that's what we're really getting at here, right? Like, yeah, I'd like, no nooses to be found really anywhere, but I'd like no nooses to be found in NASCAR. I'd like no Confederate flags. I'd like more Black. Honestly, I'd like to be treated as a human being. And when we start breaking it down to that level, yeah, I want to see more black folk on TV. Yeah, I want to see more black writers in Hollywood. Yeah, I want to see more black sports reporters covering sports and news. I want to see these things, more black CEOs, more black people in positions of power in general. Of course, I want to see that. But at the core of all of this is just wanting to be treated as a human being. And that kind of change doesn't come by us incrementally walking back certain restrictions and laws and limitations that have been on the books for years that we could have changed at any point, but we now find politically advantageous to change. I am not a political talking point. Me and my people, we are not a political talking point. Breonna Taylor is not a political talking point. That's real. That's real for everyone involved here. And we've got to get serious, really serious about what we're willing to do in order to affect that change. And also those contingency plans that say, look, if that change doesn't come, this is what we are going to do. We're not going to throw our hands up and say, well, we tried. The political approach. Again, that's for another podcast. I don't want to get into politics in this one necessarily. I read this article a little bit earlier. I'll share it on my Twitter page and on my Facebook as well. I found it to be a really, really thorough piece about defunding the police and the argument for defunding the police there in New Orleans. And an excerpt from the end of this article, I think it's called "Accept Nothing Than Police Abolition." There you go, by Lydia Pillow Hobbs. Again, I'll repost that on my page so folks can check it out. I thought she had a great sort of the entire article was great. I think one of the last parts that got me, she said, now is the time to be uncompromising in the assertion that directing state resources toward law enforcement in the name of reform cannot undo the structure of racial violence that is policing. Rather, history shows us that it drains our taxpayer budgets from investments in care. I thought that hit particularly hard. We cannot simply change certain aspects around or add money or take away money from police departments and expect that that's going to change the structure, as she puts it, of racial violence that is policing. These things have to be considered in what we are pushing for. Because if we're just pushing for rule changes, that'll happen in the moment and nowhere else. And that's exactly where it'll stop. I don't want it to be a rule not to kill black people. I want it to be a part of the culture that we would never want to do that for any sort of egregious reason at all. That we would want to treat each other with respect. And I think unearthing that future or unlocking that future requires a lot more action than what we're seeing right now. All right, so let's get to some of the comments that are here. We do have a few comments, and I appreciate, folks, if you do have a comment or would like to ask a question, please feel free in the comment section. Leave me a question, leave me a comment, and I'll read it for you right now. And also, don't forget, we are streaming live Instagram, Facebook, Twitter as well. Make sure you follow us on all those pages. The information in the bottom left, especially if you're watching on Facebook and Twitter. All right, let's get to some of the things here. Leonard Richardson says, good evening. Good evening, Leonard. I appreciate you listening. Robert Peterson saying, the protest will lose steam at some point. I agree with you on this, and that's what some are hoping. We need to see policies that held a strong presence in the equity of workplace and housing. We will never be able to legislate thoughts of hate. And I agree very much so with that last part, especially legislating thoughts of hate. I've always found, prosecuting for hate crimes to be a near impossible task because of this extreme burden of evidence and of proof that you really need for federal hate crime charges. For instance, even if the FBI in that instance, I think, would have come in there and said, look, this is clearly a noose. It's clearly here in your garage stall. The amount of evidence and the mountain of evidence that would still have to be presented even after that would be tremendous just to be able to prove that that was indeed a hate crime. Right? Because it would have to be that someone intentionally tied it. They would have to have proof of that. Someone intentionally put it there in Bubba Wallace's stall after they knew that Bubba Wallace was already going to be in that stall. And more than likely, they would have had to have proven that that person did that thing with an intent to cause racial harm, if you will, or racial damage to that person. And that could have been just a mountain of evidence in and of itself right there. And so something that can be simply analyzed. Look, you tell me someone left a noose in my locker or in my garage where in my place of employment. I think it's pretty clear what that indication sort of means, most especially after I, as one of the only African Americans working in that group, just pushed for something that culturally affects many whites in this country, especially in the South, and many that watch NASCAR as well. If somebody leaves a noose in my presence after something like that, I don't have to have a big FBI investigation to understand that that was racially motivated. To be honest with you, if they did catch the person that was responsible for that, I don't care if you slap them with hate crime charges. I care that you deal with them in some sort of way where they're outside of society, where they don't have an opportunity to impact or to take actions like this any longer. I don't care what you call it, federal hate crime charges, noose crime charges, whatever. Just get it done. It's the way that I look at it. But it's a tremendous mountain of evidence that I think that you need for federal hate crime charges. And it constantly, frustrates me that when the FBI does investigate something like this, and they come back with the result and come back with the idea that they concluded that a hate crime never really happened here, that this wasn't really something that was going on, then suddenly everyone washes their hands of it and says, well, the FBI investigated and there was no hate crime, so that must mean it wasn't racist. Told you, the country's not racist. A lot of people hide behind that kind of thing. I don't find it productive at all. But it's some of the things that I think that we can focus on, I think, less in the instance of, are we going to win this individual case? Am I going to get justice in this individual situation? Maybe not, but that doesn't mean that, we're not on our way to some significant change. I think in that same sort of way. NASCAR is not the most progressive organization in the entire world. And I think some of these nuances that we have in between about whether or not it was this intent or that intent, they really can't be proven through courts, not through our current legal system. And that is a problem. That's absolutely a problem. The way that race is legislated, I think, is a bit unfair. I think it needs to be revived. And again, I'm talking about the flipping of tables, not the replacing of individuals that might be making these decisions. And I think that that's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable, but good. That's the word of the year this year for 2020. Uncomfortable. Be uncomfortable. That's how you know you're doing it right. Anyway, thank you for joining us on the show. I appreciate it. Make sure you follow at Keaton D. Nichols everywhere. Of course, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. On Periscope. You can catch me at A Nichols Worth. A Nichols Worth. That's all you got to do is search that. You can subscribe to my podcast, which airs live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 8 p.m. at anchor.fm/A Nichols Worth. That's anchor.fm/A Nichols Worth. Until Friday, I will see everyone on the flip side. Everybody be safe out there.